For tonight, our speaker, I don't really know a lot about him, but one thing I do know, he's working on the railroad. And Tom Testa is president of the Downeast Scenic Railroad, and for all I know, the boss of this institution, which is now up on the wall. Is that right? Other than that, I don't know a lot about him. He lives in Bar Harbor, away from here, but that's all right. The thing that's amazing to me is that this basically is an historical society, much like ours. It's more than that, it's an historical society living museum. And that's really an amazing institution itself. With a huge capital investment, and it's not just a fun ride. It's a monument to history, and I'm glad that the only thing I'm glad of is that you don't have any steam engines, which I'm used to in my youth, but which as a Ellsworth resident, I'm glad there aren't any of those steam engines working away. But this is going to be a revelation, a really transformational thing that happened with the railroad, and Tom Testa is going to tell you all about it. Tom.
Thank you all for coming, but you had other business going on. I'll just chime in and say that's how I got to be president of the railroad. I missed a meeting. No, we have a great time doing it. Just to tell you a little bit about who we are, we're the Downeast Rail Heritage Preservation Trust that was founded in 2005 as a 501(c) nonprofit with its mission to operate the railroad, or to at least try to. There were 5 of us who got together in 2004, having watched the rail line sit in various uses of disuse since the abandonment of service by then owner Guilford and the sale of the rail line to the state of Maine. We got together. We had been talking over the years. The line was bought in 1987 through a bond approved by the voters of Maine. And we'll get into that a little bit more in the future. And what we proposed to do was to try to at least commemorate the heritage and the history of this rail line, because we felt it was so important to this area. And I'll just throw in one thing. I'm sort of a Gouldsboro native. My great-great-grandfather landed here in 1827 from Ireland. So I've still got a lot of research to do. In between, I'll get to that. The mission of the Trust is to celebrate and preserve the railroad heritage of Downeast, Maine, and our immediate primary goal is to develop the Downeast Scenic Railroad for the education, enlightenment, and enjoyment of future generations. Give you a little background on where railroading was and how I lead into how this came to be. In the post-Civil War era, railroads were a burgeoning thing. Any of us who are old enough to remember something called the dot-com bubble? This was the dot-com bubble of the day. Everybody was going to get rich building railroads. And much like the times then, the overbuilding was incredible. By 1870, the United States had 35,000 miles of railroads. So let's just go back and take a look at this growth from 1830, 1840, 1850, and then on to 1870. The Panic of 1873 caused a huge railroad collapse in this country. The failure of the J. Cook Company, as well as Mr. Gould and his Erie Railroad, which failed, took down pretty much most of the railroads at the time. Anybody know who this scary guy is? It's J.P. Morgan. In 1884, J.P. Morgan convened a meeting between the Pennsylvania Railroad President Thompson and the New York Central President Depew on his yacht, the Corsair, off the coast of New Jersey. And he told them to stop what they were doing because they were killing each other. What they were doing was building over the top of one another. One building up the east shore of the Hudson, one building up the west shore of the Hudson. The Pennsylvania Railroad was being chased by the New York Central all the way out to to Pittsburgh. And coincidentally, for any of you from that part of Pennsylvania, know that the part of the Pennsylvania Turnpike was built on the unfinished grade of the New York Central line that was being built when Morgan told him to stop it. Because much like a gas war, nobody wins. There simply were not enough customers for everybody to service. Just so happens, though, that Mr. Morgan not only sat on the board of the New York Central, but his firm Drexel and Company also financed the Pennsylvania Railroad. So he didn't exactly have an altruistic interest. But what this changed in America was this expansive overbuilding, and that railroads began to look at buying up smaller lines and consolidating them into their own operation. No railroads existed in eastern Maine until 1868, with the opening of the European and North American, which ran from Bangor to Milford, and then later expanding in 1871 on to Vanceboro. The point of this railroad was really quite interesting. It was to cut down the amount of time people spent on ships going to Europe. The idea was that the further north they could get people, they could take 2 to 3 days off what was known as a pretty miserable voyage across the North Atlantic, and anything that would reduce that was seen as a great boon. 1871 is the first time a proposal to build a shoreline was floated. It was seen as a necessity to build along the coast because it was one of the two primary population centers of Maine at that time, the other being Aroostook County. In 1872, a charter was obtained from the 51st legislature by various coastal citizens to build a railroad from Bangor to Calais, and building was to commence from Bangor to Ellsworth, to Cherryfield, Machias, and on to Calais. But in 1873, this all came to an end when the city of Bangor's citizens voted down a bond issue which would have financed 60% of the venture. So in those days, how railroads were financed primarily were by towns subscribing to the railroad because they wanted the railroad to go through their town to provide this connectivity and also the economic benefits that could come from it. In 1874, money was raised to extend the Bucksport and Bangor, which many don't know, but is the Bucksport branch today that runs down the eastern side of the Penobscot. And the Bucksport and Bangor proposed building through Penobscot and Surrey onto Ellsworth, and it was going to be called the Penobscot and Union River, and it would have run across into Ellsworth. They initially raised $500,000 in funding, but the Bucksport residents feared greatly that by Ellsworth having a rail connection, it would be the demise of Bucksport, and they were afraid with the possible burgeoning of a port in Ellsworth that it would be detrimental to them. However, Ellsworth was determined to have a railroad. In 1883, the Ellsworth American wrote that the winter blockade of 4 months and that there are 83,000 people in Washington and Hancock County without rail service that brings communication and convenience, and a lack of dependable, non-weather dependent transportation was hurting the commerce and the commercial trades of the region. They further cited that paying for an entire winter's stock, whether for business or home, was strangling what capital was available by missing out on paying prevailing market prices, because basically Ellsworth was a cold harbor. There was no movement in and out during the winter. And as we all know, there's 2 seasons in Maine, the 4th of July and winter. And it was detrimental to the people living there. It's just one of the Maine Central steamers locked in the ice, which we'll talk about in a little bit. That's one of the great ironies of all this. The largest industry at the time in the area was timber, and it could only be shipped 8 months of the year. During the 1880s, the number one proponent, this will be our hero, Colonel John N. Greene, Greene. I'm always asked, is it anything to do with Green Lake? No, it's not. Colonel Greene was, by all accounts, an ambitious man. He was a Civil War Union Army railroad engineer and mining engineer. And he had built, after the Civil War, had built several small railroads in upstate New York. In 1881, he was building what was going to be called the Grand Southern Railroad from St. John to St. Stephen, New Brunswick. It was only 82 miles long, and for his labors, he received $50,000 worth of stock, and they couldn't pay him, so they made him president of the railroad. Sounds a lot like this. It had become apparent to the colonel that the Grand Southern would never really amount to much without a connection into the United States, given its isolated nature. So the colonel was quite forward-thinking. In fact, he wanted to get to Bangor. Some way, somehow, he knew this line had to connect to Bangor. And he felt that if the shoreline could be built along into Maine, that sooner or later he would somehow get to Bangor, passing through Washington and Hancock counties. One of the big things he did was in 1881, he went to the 60th Maine legislature and got them to pass an act to incorporate the Maine Shoreline Railroad. After his lobbying, Colonel Greene began lining up financing for the Maine Shoreline while still in the process of finishing building the Grand Southern. It was very difficult for him to come out with financing. Many of the towns in the proposed routes that he was looking at simply did not have the money to put up. So he went to the Maine Central Railroad. Now, the Maine Central Railroad was never a railroad builder per se. They were a railroad consolidator. Much like the story I told earlier with J.P. Morgan, they were very smart about what they did and how they went through the state of Maine, amassing these smaller railroads that existed with the idea of creating a system. Instead of getting to Bangor and having to wait 8 hours for some other railroad to arrive, they could create a system with a functioning schedule. The one thing about relying on the Maine Central, they're a big company with a president whose last name was Jackson. President Jackson was a very shrewd man. So as he continued to try financing, he finally did have to rely solely on the Maine Central. Now, about this same time, the Bucksport and Bangor got wind of what was going on, and they immediately started to offer to build a railroad from Bucksport to Ellsworth. They were going to get beat to the punch, however. In 1882, the Bangor and Bucksport was foreclosed, and the new owners, the Maine Central, and the bondholders of the Bucksport and Bangor created what was then called the Eastern Maine Railroad, and all thoughts of entertaining any idea about going to Ellsworth were dropped. So, to get back to Ellsworth, proceeding under caution and under the direction of one very influential stockholder of the new Maine Shoreline, Lucilius Emery, of Ellsworth. He was a lawyer and a citizen and a director, also of the Eastern Maine Railroad, which I just mentioned. He did not want anything interfering with the building of the Maine Shoreline. And he was afraid also that that would jeopardize his holdings. We try to give these people some sort of credit, but you got to remember, they were trying to make money. This was the way of the world at that point in time. In 1883, the colonel went to the 61st legislature on his own, voted, and got them to vote to charter and allow all the rights to the Maine Shoreline for any bridges owned by the Eastern Maine Railroad, which if you think in Bangor, that's what they were referring to, which is the bridge that crosses the Penobscot. So the line that he was proposing to build would then be built off of the line that was the Bucksport and Bangor in Brewer. Now, one of the things that the colonel had to succumb to were the wishes of the Maine Central Railroad. The Maine Central Railroad was very much interested in getting this connection here. I guess it'd be better. I've never used one of these before. So the connection was here. The bridge is back over here. This is the Bucksport and Bangor, or now known as the Bucksport branch. And this is where what we know today as the Calais branch came off of it. The Maine Central and their President Jackson were very much interested in what was going on around the country at that time. Maine Central was not terribly interested in the colonel's ideas of going further up the coast and connecting with the Grand Southern. There was this park on a place called Mount Desert Island where people were going to. And much like the other rail lines in the country at the time, the New York Central going into the Adirondacks and the New Haven going into the Berkshires, the Pennsylvania Railroad up into the Poconos, these were summer resorts, and this is what the Maine Central was after. They wanted to bring people to these places. The colonel's plan would sit for quite a while to try to build up the coast, and he ceded his interest to build the 40-mile rail line. It was designed to be built for speed, for passenger cars, and freight was sort of a secondary thought at that point because the Maine Central was very, very much interested in what had become a new burgeoning industry at the time, which was tourism. Up until that point, nobody really traveled very far. Of course, people from the cities would flee in the summers due to the heat. They would send their families somewhere else. They may stay in the city and still work and go spend time with their families. But one thing that they were all fleeing that they didn't understand at the time was cholera. This was a huge problem in major cities during the summer months, and they wanted to get their families out of there. And most of these vacation type places, as we would call them today, were fairly reasonable even for the modest traveler of the day. A clerk working for J.P. Morgan could afford to take his family and send them off somewhere for the summer. But one of the best ideas they had was in building this line, which made incredible sense, was the Maine Central Railroad already had a steamer fleet. They had ferries that plied the coast from Portland to Rockland, to Bar Harbor, up the coast. So what they were able to do is lay out this line, this 40-mile line from Brewer down onto the Hancock Peninsula to McNeil Point, not Hancock Point. You always hear Hancock Point. It's not Hancock, it's McNeil Point on the eastern shore of the Hancock Peninsula. And because the Maine Central already owned these steamers, they could then make the additional 6-mile trip across Frenchman Bay to what was then the Maine Central Wharf in Bar Harbor, which is now the town pier, which becomes the irony of them looking for a non-weather dependent form of travel because the last 6 miles, well, we all know what a summer in August can be here where you can't see 3 feet in front of you for 2 weeks. So, but anyways, they made do and they continued to build. Because Bar Harbor had this increasing draw for the wealthy and the well-to-do, the Maine Central knew that they could make not only selling passengers to travel on board, but for the private rail car, the private jet of its day. We've been told, and I can't prove this, that this is the interior of the Vanderbilt's car, but it would make sense considering there's a fireplace in it. Every rail car should have a fireplace in it. They knew that the upper class traveler only went one way, and that was going to be in their private car, and they could charge huge sums for that. Because of the seasonal nature of the venture, Maine Central felt it could be supplemented with freight, but unlike many other railroads that were built primarily to serve a freight market, they weren't hauling coal, they weren't hauling iron ore, something like that. They were simply after the passengers, and the freight came second. But what that freight coming second did is it opened up this area for everybody here. It allowed them to receive goods from the outside, it allowed them to ship goods out, and to create a far greater economy than would have otherwise been had, because just standing in one place and exchanging dollars between a couple of people is not a great way to build your economic base. Of course, the cost, they looked at laying rails to Bar Harbor. For the seasonality of what they were trying to do, the cost was simply too great, and that's why the steamers were chosen. So what was finally agreed on is Colonel Jackson and Colonel Green and President Jackson of Maine Central agreed that Maine Central would actually fund the building of the line. Colonel Green would build it and then lease the track rights back from the Maine Central, with the Maine Central trains actually running on the rails. Initially, the line was officially called the Maine Shoreline, but that would not last long. And finally, Eastern Maine would be connected to the rest of the world. So on Monday, May 14th, hello, change, somebody? Monday, May 14th, 1883, beginning in Brewer, beginning 3 months ahead of what their charter called for them to start construction, they began building the Maine Shoreline Railroad. Now, think about that, from 1881 till 1883. We haven't been able to get the 395 connector built in 10 years. And so, different time, but the fact that they got their charter, went, surveyed, laid out the route of the line, and were able to, and given, they went through 2 winters, that they were able to do all this. It's pretty amazing. I always marvel at just the whole thought of what they were able to do given the modes of transportation, the equipment available to them at the time. So if you imagine looking into the deepest, darkest woods and go, okay, 66-foot wide right away through here. We're going to pull every stump. We're going to go across every brook and stream and river. And we're going to do all of this with buck saws, axes, mule carts. It really is quite an engineering miracle. They would use steam-powered shovels, but they also used 500 Italian laborers that were brought in from Boston and New York, who were paid the very good wage of $1.50 a day. And they got 1 day off, Christmas. They basically worked 7 days a week. Some documents in the Ellsworth American mention Sunday afternoons. They had time to themselves. Full documentation of the whole building of the line is fairly sketchy, so we have to assume that things went pretty much as planned. But to go through these areas, to fell these trees, pull all these stumps, as well as fill, to put in fill into gaps. They took the most grade-friendly route they could. That's why so many of these lines built in those days were run along the shores of ponds and lakes, because that was the flattest point to go to and avoid mountains, inclines, and other obstructions. It was really quite a feat. Now, On February 19th, 1884, a mere 9 months from starting, they laid the first tracks across the Main Street in Ellsworth. So they had already made it some 30 miles through the winter, building this rail line. They held an open house. President Jackson showed up. And then on June 23rd, which we just celebrated last week, was 1884, was the first revenue passenger train to come to Ellsworth. So in a pretty quick time, they made all that happen. And last Sunday, June 23rd, was the 140th anniversary of that. We had a piece of cake. And paid our homages to Colonel Green, who I still think, for whatever reasons, somebody should build a statue to him. Because what he did for this area, with his idea, really changed things. So they continued working after that through Hancock and down through onto Waukeg. They originally were going to build to the eastern approach of Ellsworth. That picture we are guessing is somewhere in the 1890s. And that's the Ellsworth Depot that, if you're familiar with Ellsworth, where Maine Community Foundation is now, this depot was actually out at the street, and it burned in 1928. What is now the Maine Community Foundation was then built by the Maine Central as the depot from there. But they continued to work through the rest of the summer and build down from Washington Junction down through. The rail line came across here, down the river, and they were good. See this place here, Ferry Point? That was where they were intending to go to build wharfs. But what they found when they got there was that the current and tides were far too great. So a group of Ellsworth businessmen chipped in and bought this land down here, further down at what would be McNeil Point. And that's where the wharfs, et cetera, were built. And that would be the terminus that became known as Mount Desert Ferry. So here's Mount Desert Ferry from a valuation map, I think from 1906. So you can see that, can everybody see this? Back up a little bit. So what you have initially is you have a turntable and a roundhouse, you have storage tracks, and this track went to where the wharfs were, right here along these various tracks. Now remember, this was only used basically 2.5 months a year. That's when people came right before the 4th of July and Labor Day hit and everybody flee. So beginning with the first run, we know of anything that was oriented towards this passenger express business was called the Mount Desert Limited. And it began in 1885 and would run from New York all the way to Mount Desert Ferry. Then in 1917, they introduced the all-Pullman Bar Harbor Express, which would run from, actually portions of it would start in Washington, D.C., then Philadelphia, and then New York. And the train would run up through Connecticut, sometimes going north at New Haven, other times up through Providence. The train never went to Boston. It went around Boston. And in the early 1900s, the daily train count coming in and out of Mount Desert Ferry would be as many as 7 trains in and 6 trains out a day, roughly about 3,500 people a day. It's pretty amazing. Later on in the 1920s, the Bar Harbor Express would split at Portland into 2 sections, one for Bar Harbor and one for Rockland. And that's the Maine Central Wharf in Bar Harbor. My great-grandfather used to run a store somewhere in there, so I've been told, selling things to tourists. My family's done their whole life. That's sort of the iconic picture of Mount Desert Ferry. That's been seen in all kinds of publications over the years. I always say I was born 100 years too late. I would have loved to have seen it. And that's a hotel called the Bluffs, where visitors could stay, either waiting to go on a ferry to Mount Desert Island or coming back from Mount Desert Island to stay until the train left the next day. Unfortunately for our dear friend, the Colonel, his life didn't turn out so well. After the Maine Shoreline was completed, he wanted to build up the coast. Maine Central wanted no part of it. They could see no benefit to them whatsoever. They had entertained the idea but found it to be nothing that they wanted to be involved with. So over the years, he kept trying to sell subscriptions to towns like Sullivan and Calais and Cherryfield to try to build this railroad, and sort of threatening them, telling them if they didn't subscribe to the plan, they would never have a rail connection to the outside world, which seems to have not made him very popular with many people. But 2 years into the operation of the Maine Shoreline, he was so deeply in debt that he finally signed over the Maine Shoreline and all its contracts to the Maine Central. Maine Central had signed a 999-year lease when they built the line. I think they knew where this was going. So it is, by 1887, they had fully taken over the operation. One of the things that's very interesting about the Bar Harbor Express is it ran at night. So photos of it are few and far between. We take so much for granted, and we also take for granted that somebody was actually, there are people, we all know people who photographed railroads, but it would be like going out and photographing your Toyota Tacoma today. It's just a stinking train. Photography was difficult then, it was expensive. So we have scoured things, and I tell everybody I talk to, if you find any information, we would love to have it. Every once in a while, the most obscure thing will pop up from somewhere that we didn't know. And one of the things that we really never find out is whatever ultimately happened to Colonel Green. But this becomes part of the story of how, that's at Grant Cove on the east side of the Hancock Wing, so that is a picture of the Bar Harbor Express. Probably leaving in the afternoon, headed to Washington Junction, and on to Bangor, and then on to parts south. So this leads into the Washington County Railroad, which we are not, our organization is not dedicated to that. We have some knowledge of it. But with Colonel Green's floundering with trying to build a railroad up through into Washington County, the folks there had finally given up on the Colonel, and they organized their own railroad company. And by 1886, the Colonel was seen and heard of no more. His disastrous demise had come to an end, and the poor guy, it sounded like he tried with all his heart to make it happen, but they went through lawsuits and back and forth over the years from the late 1880s into the early 1890s. And one of the best books you can read about the Washington County Railroad is The Sunrise Route by Michael Zimmerman. It's an excellent book. There is a whole chapter in there on the building of the Maine Shoreline, and he gets into great detail about who did what to who and all the shenanigans in the Maine legislature. You can imagine how that went in those days, handing out railroad charters. I'm sure nobody got any money out of that deal. In 1898, the Washington County Railroad was completed from Calais down to Ayers Junction, on to Machias, Cherryfield, and ultimately to a place called Washington Junction. So, we'll jump ahead a little bit. But in January of 1895, the the Maine Central finally completely did away with the Maine Shoreline, and that name ceased to exist anymore. And the Maine Central then called the line from Brewer to Mount Desert Ferry the Bar Harbor branch of the Maine Central. This is a layout of Washington Junction, where we have our home and our boarding facility. A few highlights here to point out to you. It was the western terminus of the Washington County Railroad. When the Maine Shoreline was built, this was the line that was built that then went down to McNeil Point. When the Washington County Railroad was built, this was the line that they built coming into Washington Junction. That's how it's got its name, Washington Junction. As the western terminus, it had a roundhouse and a turntable. We can still see the top of the turntable pit in our yard. Of course, it's all been filled in. And right here was the Washington County Railroad depot, which I have a picture of, we'll show you in a bit. People would take trains on the Maine Central to this depot, of course, then switch for a train to go the Washington County Railroad further up the coast. And the express trains would take this route. If someone was coming, say, from McNeil Point and wanted to, for some reason, go up to Washington County, the trains that ran that route would take this line here onto the Washington County tracks, and then they would go from there. So this is the list. This is the list of all the railroads that the Maine Central consolidated over the years to build their system in the state of Maine. Way too many to sit here and read them all to you, but it is quite fascinating how they approached this. They couldn't have been any smarter. They knew exactly what they were doing. These small little lines that were disjointed, had poor connections for people to get to the outside world. And what they did is they created a market for themselves. Timber was moved, all kinds of goods were moved. I mean, even from Washington County, we know that even up into the 60s, places like Stewart's and Wyman's packing plants in Cherryfield sent out carloads of product. Even places like Eastport, canned sardines, a bygone thing for a lot of people. But canned sardines were immensely popular. Any tinned food in the early 1900s was seen as a great commodity. It didn't spoil, easy to keep. When you got tired of canning everything all summer so you could make it through the winter, you could open a can of sardines. So it was a different time, a different place. Now, the poor Washington County Railroad had its own struggles. By 1904, they had fell on hard times. And who was there to save them? The Maine Central Railroad. The Washington County Railroad would cease to exist by 1911. There would be no more name of the Washington County Railroad, and when the Maine Central took it over, what the line would then be called is what its moniker is today, the Calais branch. It was the Calais branch of the Maine Central Railroad, which ran 126 miles from Brewer to Calais. The Bar Harbor branch, and later what would become the Calais branch, at least the portion down to Mount Desert Ferry, was the pride of the line. In one year, in 1890, it accounted for 11% of all the company's passenger revenues, and even on some it exceeded some lines' freight revenues as well. It was maintained to a very, very high standard because of the people who traveled on it. We have been the beneficiaries, believe it or not, of that maintenance. That portion of line, when we started working on it, was relatively easy to restore. It needed tie replacement, but it's really hard to imagine. You know, you look back 100 years and you go, these guys knew what they were doing. They had built it to such an exceptionally high quality. Plus, even though Maine Central had let it deteriorate, when the Maine Department of Transportation took it over, they actually did keep the line in decent shape. They didn't put a lot of money into it. They would herbicide spray it periodically. They would make sure the line stayed open. They would fill any washouts. They did not want the line to deteriorate into such a state that it was never going to be usable. It was their bread and butter, and President Jackson was to have said that the line rode so remarkably smooth, there's never been a cause for a drop of coffee or a drop of champagne to spill. And every spring, the president would ride that line to be sure it met the standards that they wanted to keep for these passengers. And this level of maintenance was continued even up into the 50s. Now, this line sort of suffered from two periods of, I won't say suffered, it blossomed and then was quite productive for the railroad up until the Depression. Its heyday was into the 1920s. And then it would again go through a very, very hard time, struggling, of course, through the Depression into the 30s, and would see its next revival, of course, during World War II. But they did maintain it well and keep it so that they could have, great passenger traffic. The Grand Southern that the Colonel was building would eventually be bought by the Canadian National. Maine Central would connect at Calais eventually off of the Washington County Railroad going into Canada. The line operated well into the 1960s, but one of the things that became its greatest demise was the automobile, as we've all heard about railroads. With regards to Mount Desert Island, the automobile was first allowed on Mount Desert Island in 1913, and that really started to chip away at the traffic. People would, take other forms of transportation to get there, and many proposals were made to try to somehow keep the service going, but with the Depression, and also at the same time, the coastal ferry steamers that the Maine Central Railroad had lived their useful life. They had come to a point of deterioration, and the Maine Central simply was not going to spend the money, especially given what the drops in traffic they were seeing, to purchase or have built new steamers. So the last train to Mount Desert Ferry was in September of 1930, and from then on the Bar Harbor Express would turn at Ellsworth. But even during World War II, Bar Harbor Express was suspended completely and would only begin running after World War II, and then only 3 days a week. So one of the first cutbacks in service came in 1928, of course, with the demise of the steamers. The Ellsworth portion would last until 1958, and by 1958 the Bar Harbor Express was going only to Bangor, and buses would connect people down east through Ellsworth. The last run of the Bar Harbor Express was in 1960 on September 5th, and left Bangor for the south one last time. Freight service would continue, but also at the same time, Maine Central discontinued all its passenger services. There were no more locals of any kind. The line struggled into the 70s. Maine Central managed to fend off bankruptcy at least twice, once in the late 60s, once in the early 70s. They managed to stay out of the disastrous Penn Central merger. For any of you who know the history of that, when the Penn Central merged, or the Pennsylvania and the New York Central merged, the real thing that put the nail in their coffin is if they didn't have enough problems, was they were required by the Interstate Commerce Commission to take on the New Haven. And they thought the next thing that was going to be added was the Boston and Maine and the Maine Central. Thank God they at least were able to stay out of that. But the freight traffic continued well into the 70s. But the amount of service they were giving, the people they were servicing, propane plants, oil, things like that were dwindling. Trucks were far more preferred. Even the logging business, timber, a truck could go from forest to mill door in a day as opposed to several days. The Maine Central had made a huge market out of servicing the timber industry here in Maine. Of course, with the demise of many mills, that went away as well. So, to recap, here we are, somewhere here. Here's Rockland. These are the lines that ran up, and then here's the lines down the coast. So they had quite a network, and of course a lot of this, you get up into these parts of Maine, you know, we're looking at timber business, but that was declining. In June of 1981, the Maine Central was sold to Timothy Mellon, who founded Guilford Transportation Industries, and it operated the line, as I said earlier, until 1985. Up until that time, the only customer really left along the branch was the Woodland Paper Mill in Baileyville, outside of Calais. So to give you an idea of how that worked, in the railroad industry, there's a rule of thumb that for every mile of track you have, you need 100 cars of business a year. So this line would have required 12,600 cars of freight every year just to maintain it. We're not talking about making a profit. We're talking about just maintaining the line. When they stopped service in 1985, they were taking approximately 3,800 cars a year to the mill in Baileyville on the Calais Bridge. So it doesn't take long to do that math to know that that wasn't going to last forever. So, like I said earlier, in 1987, the voters of Maine voted to buy this line, the Rockland branch, and the Mountain Division. It was a total of 356 miles for the price of $900,000, or $2,600 a mile. So that was a pretty good deal for the state of Maine. And to have the foresight to preserve these linear corridors for whatever use may come down the road. It was very forward-thinking of them to do that. So if you start looking at the long-term benefits of what did they do? Well, they opened us to the world, and the world to us. That's why I would say Colonel Green should have a statue built to him. Somebody would have done it, I suppose, eventually, but really it created new markets. It brought people here. Some people don't like that, but you know, it created an economy in a place where making a living could be very, very hard. We'll talk about a few of the other things. Of course, what did the rail line do also? Took men off to war. I met a gentleman back in 2011 who was boarding the train. We had been boarding by Maine Community Foundation at that time. And he came up to me, he said, last time I got on a train in Ellsworth, I was gone for 4 years. I said, where did you go? He goes, they shipped me to France. And a lot didn't come home as well. But it did tie us to the world. We even got the circus in Ellsworth in the 1940s. That's taken at the old freight yard, which is now where the Comfort Inn is, in case any of you know that. Maine Central, when they started seeing their own demise, began selling off parcels of land. They no longer needed the freight yard in Ellsworth. They had a freight yard at Washington Junction, so they sold that off, and that's how the Comfort Inn ended up there. Here's the story of the railroad that never was. How many of you are familiar with Main Street in Ellsworth, Cadillac Mountain Sports. Does everybody know where I'm talking about? Cadillac Mountain Sports sits right about here. This is where the old Irving service station used to be 20 years ago, for anybody that remembers, before they moved across the street. Yeah, it says Mount Desert Transit Company. This is one of my favorite stories. In 1906, George Dorr, father of Acadia, and his partner, John S. Kennedy, proposed building an interurban line from Ellsworth onto Mount Desert Island. It was going to be an electrified line, interurban cars such as trolleys. They were going to have stations in Oak Point, in Trenton, Salisbury Cove on Mount Desert Island, and in Bar Harbor. As a matter of fact, the Catholic Church at Ledge Lawn and Mount Desert Street in Bar Harbor was going to be the location of the station in Bar Harbor, which obviously didn't come about, and the land got donated to the Diocese of Portland. But they proposed this entire scheme, electrified line. Also, a line would run down what is now Route 102 to Southwest Harbor. They felt that the fishermen deserved a quicker way to get their catches to market, and they thought this was a magnificent idea. People could get off. The idea was that there's the rail line, and they would be able to get off there, and they could avoid the ferry service, because the ferry service, they knew, again, we get back to this non-weather dependent mode of transportation, and they realized that they had a problem with that, also that the steamers at some point were going to become obsolete. According to all accounts, they did all the calculations on the minimum power that would be required to be generated for this line, and they found that going into Bar Harbor, for any of you who are familiar with Bar Harbor, where Hull's Cove is and the grade that goes up through there into Bar Harbor, was going to require such a huge power demand that it simply became economically unfeasible. Now, anecdotally, I've heard that many years later somebody went and checked the calculations and they had the calculations wrong. How many bridges in America have fallen because the engineer put the decimal place one side to the right too many or whatever? We'll never know. But it was an interesting idea. But they were, the reason they were doing it, they were getting pushed to allow automobiles onto Mount Desert Island. And they were looking for a way to get people onto the island besides the ferries. And that was sort of their homage to, let's not let automobiles on, we'll do this and there won't be any automobiles. Well, that lasted until 1913, so only a few years later. So this is one of our locomotives, the Downeast Scenic. We tried to emulate the photo of the Washington County Railroad sometime in the obviously late 1890s. That was the Washington County Depot at Washington Junction. So that, if you remember from the map I showed before, it's coming in on that line, and then what you can see here with these cars are on what was the original Maine Shoreline route, and eventually that would head down to the Hancock Peninsula. A nice postcard of Hancock, and the depot in Hancock. This is our wonderful group, and I have a nice collection of photos I just sort of go through here because I don't know that people will ever see them. That is the depot, the Washington County Depot, taken in 1966, looking very forlorn. I've talked to a couple of people, and they don't think it survived much after 1966. Oh, these are some photos. There seems to have been some kind of derailment on the line somewhere out north of Ellsworth. This had to be from the late 1890s, early 1900s, based on the equipment in the photos. Connection there, and this just gives you a little closer up view of how the line went.